coming on with us tonight. My name is Jackie with Hub City, and I'm here with Luke Hankins, Jeremy Griffin, and Jordan Rice. We're really thankful to have all three of them here with us. So I'm going to give a little introduction for Luke, and he is going to take it from there and introduce our authors as they go along. If you have any questions, if you'll type them into the chat window, Luke will field those to the authors. It can be to one or both authors, specify if you have a preference. And we do have copies of both books, and they will be signed copies at Hub City, so we hope that you'll think about getting those from us to support us and the authors. So Luke Hankins was born in Mississippi in 1984 and grew up in Louisiana before moving to his current home in Asheville, North Carolina. He's a graduate of the Indiana University MFA program in creative writing, where he held the Yusef Kaminyaka Fellowship in Poetry. His second poetry collection, Radiant Obstacles, was released by Whitman Stock in 2020. He is also the author of the poetry collection, Week Devotions, and a book of essays, The Work of Creation, and is the editor of Poems of Devotion, an anthology of recent poets. A volume of his translations from the French of Stella Vinici Bredilescu, A Cry in the Snow and Other Poems, noted in the New York Times Book Review, was released in the international edition by Seagull Books in 2019. Hankins is co-editor with Nomi Stone of forthcoming anthologies, The Biblical Figure of Eve, which is coming this year, and an anthology of recent poems with exceptional image from Texas Review Press. Hankins is the founder and editor of Horizon Books, and in that capacity, he's joining us today as the editor of both of these books. Horizon is a nonprofit literary press focused on the life of the spirit from a broad and inclusive range of perspectives. He also serves as senior editor at Asheville Poetry Review and teaches in the Lenore Wine MA in Writing Program, UNC Asheville's Great Smokies Writing Program. Awarded the 2016 Dash Literary Journal Poetry Prize and twice shortlisted for the Montreal International Poetry Prize, Hankins' poems, essays, and translations have appeared or are forthcoming in numerous periodicals, including 32 Poems, American Literary Review, The Ecologist, Eco-Theo Review, and others. His poems have been anthologized in Without a Doubt, Poems Illuminating Faith, Misrepresented People, Poetic Responses to Trump's America, The Poet's Quest for God, The World Is Changed, Poetic Engagements with Gerard Manley Hopkins, The Southern Poetry Anthology, Volume 7, North Carolina, The Global Poetry Anthology, and Becoming Fire. Some of his poems have been translated into Albanian, French, and Serbian. Thanks so much for joining us, Luke. We're glad to have you.
Thanks so much, Jackie. That's a much longer introduction than I expected. But thank you for taking the time to go over all those boring details about me. But I am here tonight in my capacity as the founder and editor of Horizon Books. Very glad to be hosted by Jackie and Hub City Press. If you don't have Jordan's and or Jeremy's book, please order through Hub City. Support independent bookstores and support these authors and support literary presses. And I'm sure Jackie can put a link to the Hub City bookstore in the chat. A brief word about Horizon. Horizon is a press I founded about 6 years ago, and we publish literary work, including poetry, fiction, and nonfiction. And we have a sort of a unique focus on work that engages the life of the spirit from a really broad and open range of perspectives. We don't define that narrowly or ideologically. We have authors from all sorts of perspectives, religious, non-religious, undecided, but we're just interested in the big questions. We're interested in the human spirit. We're interested in, the things that matter most and have always mattered most to us as seeking and searching and wondering human beings. I'm happy to have two of our excellent authors with us tonight. Jordan, who is a poet, and Jeremy, who's a fiction writer. I think he also writes I know he also writes poetry, but we've published a collection of his fiction. Jordan will be first up, and I'll just say a brief word about each of the authors before they read, and we'll have time to field any questions after they read. I may ask a question or two, but I also invite anyone to post a question at any point during the reading or during the Q&A. Please feel free to post a question to the chat, and I will sort of field those to the authors at that point. First up, Jordan Rice, the author of Constellarium, which is a poetry collection that we published in, oh my goodness, when was it? All the way back in 2016. An amazing poetry collection that chronicles Jordan's gender transition, chronicles family history, chronicles her religious upbringing, and wrestling with that heritage, all sorts of things. The book was a finalist for the Kate Tufts Discovery Award, really major accolade. Jordan's poems have been published in all sorts of venues, including multiple issues of Best New Poets, and where's the one I wanted to mention? Troubling the Line, Trans and Genderqueer Poetry and Poetics, a really amazing anthology. She has won awards for her poems from literary magazines, including Gulf Coast, Indiana Review, Harper Pallet, Crab Orchard Review, and others. And join me, please, in welcoming Jordan, who will be reading from Constellarium. Welcome.
Thank you. That was a great introduction, and I'm glad to be here, and I've been looking forward to it, and a little nervous to do a reading online for the first time. So forgive me if there are any kind of noises in the background or anything like that. So I'm going to start with laser therapy. She pulls the trigger, and I'm crying before I know it, which is when she pauses for maybe the fourth time that day to tell me I'm brave for what I'm doing, or for being who I am. And in our small, shut room, smelling now of singed beard shadow, this crying, I worry, is something I cannot stop. And so focus on the high, whirring current in the machine to which her gun is corded by curling white tension line, like the phone attached to the wall in my parents' old house. And how, as a child, I would stand by it, twirling the slick plastic turns. I lost my place. Twirling the slick plastic turns between my fingers in the silence belonging to that kitchen, until the refrigerator cut on to hum the slow tune of sleep within loneliness. And I am sick again, as I was so often then, and close to throwing up when the nurse becomes more nurse than progressive or maternal, telling me, sit up, then lean down with your head between your knees, and places against the back of my neck a wet hand towel, folded and cold. And I would ask if I could ask in a language other than swearing air in and out of my lungs. And these god-awful sobs, I am thinking, must be an affliction like hiccups that last a hellish decade. Who does she think I am? Because only last week in a fucking Walmart, a man with his fist raised cornered me saying, faggot, you faggot. Brave is not immobility, is not speechlessness, not even the flash through your mind, you are going to die. Wherever you end up after being followed by someone like him, snatched like a moth from his light. even after managers escort him from the premises, after 4 or 5 shoppers intervene to push him away, and a policewoman, frowning and younger than you, arrives to stand near, promising your safety. Let's see. So as one might imagine, there were a lot of kind of ups and downs, especially with family throughout this whole process of transition. So lost body. Today they are talking on the radio about how to remember your infant and not leave them in car seats for swelter to unspeak them, or in the cold. Various parents raise their shoulders against here in the grocery store parking lot while I am coming out to my mother over the phone, temperate zones away, saying how I must change, that I cannot stand this body any longer. The one she remembered, held and fed and would not hold only once, when I fell beneath the rear tractor wheel, rolled under before anyone could stop the bush hog. This is the story she is telling me now, again, as though I haven't heard or can't remember what happened, like the first year after, which is blank but for scars, and the sudden noise of an engine causing night terrors. That she stood over me in that field, only thinking, my son, my son. So my father's reaction is a little different. Dresses. My father rings our apple trees with his own urine, says the scent will scare off starving deer, which strip his low limbs bare at night. His foot is almost healed, the bones screwed together, restrung with tendons from a dead teenager who was at least alone in his Camaro as it came apart on 85 near Charlotte. That could have been you, my father says, how you used to drive. Then remembers I'm less his son already. The process cumulative, accelerating. He mentions another trick if piss won't work. We'll buy a garbage bag of hair from a salon and cast it through the field. And I'm thinking of all the haircuts I never wanted, trimmed, always far above brow line. And imagine him scattering what fell from every forced summer buzz, hours worth of shears droning at my scalp. A barber shuffling the checkered floor, one a pervert with his hand beneath the nylon cape. And how much different it might have been for me, the other way around, had I been born a girl, but was really a boy, hair blonde and grown long by summer, and the heat too much, begging a $5 cut and to run nearly bald across the ballpark as long as other boys would let me. Deer still range below the field each night, become their own loose ring of seasons in this drought-made decade. And even Lake Jocassie's bearing mud, except dead center, where no children swim, its turbines slowed and power dimmed. My father will still limp from living room to kitchen to front door, stooping the gravel drive to welcome me beyond his own startle and amazement. Whomever steps from my familiar car, softer now, with rounded face, hips wide as my mother's, who cannot look at me so very long. Let's see. It's funny when you go back and forth and you dog-ear pages and you undog-ear others. And then they all pop out and you can't find anything. Epithalamion. From here, nowhere's absent shame. The body's rumored dissolute for its mutability. Even speech, the clear spoke and the speaking, my mind's a roar and hoary rasp. No voice carries. I try every one, even apology and rhetoric, the abscess of our fall. Listen. Around us whirs the sex I'm to become, violent, exact. I etch up another voice within your silence. Say, I'm sorry. Say, I am sorry. Say again, I had no choice. I lost one self to this other and killed our child's father. He'll keep me in old photos. Thin frame, red beard. Barbarossa, our priest, once called me. What will he tell our son? Your father disappeared. Speaking with the dead makes witchery. He transubstantiated. There was no sign of this proclivity when I bound them at the wrists and blessed them by our custom. All right. 2 more. The living is easy. Citronella candles flickering now, my neighbor's laughter draws me in, although I know I don't belong. Someone caps another bottle, the cooler slamming shut. Someone tells a joke. Where do they put a missing tranny's photo? On cartons of half and half. And I'm remembering my life in Richmond years ago, my mouth still split from saying no too often or too late, another time to the first man that I trusted. In the night, an artist took me home to dried acrylic, lacing color arcs across her studio. Palettes struck with brushes, her exhibit a success. Leaning up my chest, she cupped her palms there at flatness without laughing. I'll fuck you tonight if you shave your beard off first. Whatever she could tell, I couldn't say there by her sink. Barbasol, cheap razors, our stolychnia gone. Traffic echoing the gallery below and steam across the sliding mirror. My tits, she joked, still look like mosquito bites. And drawing her syringe, her estradiol, the needle jab quick into her thigh. You might as well learn how to do this now. Afterward, I followed her up flights onto the roof to see the student tenements, neon liquor districts, neighborhoods by order of surrender. Shockoe Bottom, Churchill, Jackson Ward, Oregon Hill, dim rows of shotgun houses spanning out in all directions. Bronze generals astride their horses, lit up from below, and past the river distant suburbs, silent lots, estates of perfect manicure. Somewhere, the one she'd left, no turning back allowed, until we reached the crumbling edge, to feel again that urge to fall from which I never taught my body to recoil. And last one. Suadad. Suadad. Is that how you pronounce it? I'm not sure. The first time with her in the back corner room of her father's hotel was the first time. It was New Year's and the roads were thick with ice along the Blue Ridge. There was no breaking through to go home. Some wine, matchbooks, and cigarette packs by the bedside. And afterward, I shook my father's hand in a dream, and then his father's, and on down a line of men stretching past the horizon of a bare field, and woke with my hand still clasped in another. She was pulling me up, drawing the blankets with us. It was snowing and almost dawn. I sat on the balcony above the last of the dark with her in my lap, leaning into me until the hill below us became a hill in the gray light. The drifts of grass, crooked to ground and turned chaff, became pairs of people like us, turned out, huddled down, gone to ice. Already, she shivered, clasped the blanket closer, and held the open bottle to her lips. Remember this, I told myself. Return to see the stain of her mouth and the bare yawn spiced with wine, the scent of old smoke, her eyes closing to rest a little longer. So what if her mother knocks at the door in an hour, and you must lower yourself to the frozen ground to shudder under balcony eaves? Remember her palms placed together on your chest, and her breath at your shoulder, past the men she will love and those she will take as lovers, the nights you lie alone and begin to regret. There is no sorrow in this. Sunrise and the field of flame, and she stirs in the light. There is no sorrow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Wonderful poems of deeply complex ranges of emotion. It's beautiful to hear those read. It was even nice to have to hear your sounds of your kiddos in the background. Next up, we have Jeremy Griffin, fiction writer and poet, but tonight he's reading fiction. His story collection, his second story collection, Oceanography, won our 2018 Orson Fiction Prize. It was selected by Len Samantha Chang, and it was this year named a finalist for the, or I guess now it's 2021, isn't it? Recently, he was named a finalist for the Balcones Fiction Prize. And Jeremy's previous book is A Last Resort for Desperate People, Stories and a Novella. It was published by Stephen F. Austin University Press. And his stories have appeared in a number of literary magazines, including Shenandoah, Alaska Quarterly Review, Indiana Review, Mid-American Review, Story South, and others. And Jeremy teaches at Coastal Carolina University and lives in Myrtle Beach with his family. Please join me in welcoming Jeremy Griffin.
Thank you very much, Luke. Thank you. This is awesome. This is a great event. Thank you, Jackie, for helping to put this together. I'm going to read the first few pages of a story tonight called Robo Warrior. This is one that I really like, partially because it's the oldest story in the collection. I think I started it in 2008, and I had to set it aside for a while because I couldn't figure it out. I just couldn't figure out how the story was going to work. And I came back to it a couple years later, and I realized that second person was going to be sort of the hook here. So this is a second person story that I'm really proud of. I'm going to read the first few pages, and then we can chat. So, Robo Warrior. It's Sunday afternoon, and you have accompanied your mother to Kmart to exchange the Robo Warrior action figure that your Aunt Leslie gave you several days ago for your 11th birthday. The warrior's name is Uppercut. His body is a kind of inverted pyramid with arms and legs that are almost gruesome in their musculature. He has a blonde flat top and blue skull tattoo on his right bicep, and his forearms appear to be sheathed in large silver gloves that reach up to his elbows. In theory, these are biomechanical replacement limbs composed of a titanium platinum alloy. Their function is to maximize his efficacy in hand-to-hand combat. A small trigger on his back allows his hands to rotate a full 360 degrees at the wrist. Biomechanical modifications such as these are hallmarks of the Robo Warriors, a fact you well know, given that you are an avid fan of the cartoon series, now in its 3rd season, and that you own roughly 70% of all available toy models, not including the 4 Supermax Cyber Fortress playsets, which at almost $60 a piece just aren't worth the effort it would take to con your parents into buying them for you, including an Uppercut figure exactly like the one that Leslie gave you. Out of politeness, you didn't point this out to her, though luckily she'd assured you that if you weren't happy with the toy, she wouldn't be offended if you exchanged it. Your mother has agreed to bring you along on the condition that you not pester her about the exchange until she's completed her own shopping. Watching her wrestle a cart from the long train of them inside the doors, you can see just how exhausting the past couple days have been for her. All the giddy kid birthday business. She looks like she's just woken up from a fitful sleep, her expression rigid and drowsy, her hair a riot of stringy wisps. In addition to the party at Splashtown yesterday, where she sustained a mild sunburn on her cheeks and shoulders, there was also dinner at Camelot, the medieval-themed restaurant where the servers call you sire and serve you soda in enormous plastic tankards and stage jousting matches in the middle of the arena-like restaurant. Excuse me. And so maybe it would be easier for you both if you just handled the exchange yourself. After all, you are 11 now, practically a teenager. Surely that must confer upon you some new degree of responsibility. Only she's got the receipt in her purse, and you'll need that when you go to the customer service counter, and you know there's no way she's going to let you do that by yourself, simply because that wasn't part of the deal. And so instead you ask if maybe you could at least go look at the toys while she does her shopping. Just look, you emphasize with the perfect degree of petulance, to which your mother, who you can tell is privately content to complete her shopping by herself, makes a show of sighing and rolling her eyes and then tells you, okay, so long as you stay there and don't go wandering around the store. According to the 3-paragraph synopsis on the back of the package, the Robo Warriors were created by the evil Dr. Z, a mysterious government scientist sent into exile after conducting a series of grisly biogenetic experiments on wounded American soldiers. The result of these experiments was an army of mindless cyborgs whom, through the neurocontrol chips in their brains, he was able to command from his secret laboratory in the South Pacific. Dr. Z had come to believe that modifications, outfitting people with cybernetic components that would amplify their physical and mental aptitudes, was the next logical step in human evolution. He even went so far as to modify his own brain with self-replicating neurons intended to boost his IQ. Soon, however, a small number of robo-warriors discovered a way to disrupt the signals sent to the chips, thus freeing themselves from the doctor's hypnotic grasp, and the army splintered into 2 factions, the Defenders and the Elite. The Defenders are the self-proclaimed protectors of all mankind against the Elite who, under the control of the evil Dr. Z, strive for the assimilation of all human beings through cybernetic modifications. Secretly, you've always been partial to the Elite, even though they're the bad guys. For one, their figures come with 2 weapons instead of 1 like the Defenders, and also their vehicles are flashier, more over the top, like the armored gyrocopter you got for Christmas last year with its twin rotors and sleek chrome-like finish. But mostly, it's because they don't spend every episode spouting cliched good guy phrases the way the Defenders do. Mankind is already perfect and you can't improve perfection. Friendship is the greatest weapon against evil. That "you're just fine the way you are" gospel is fitting in a typical cartoonish sort of way, but you've begun to realize it doesn't hold up in real life. Because the truth is, mankind isn't perfect. And in fact, most people spend their lives wishing they were anybody else at all. So what rational person is going to pass up laser vision or indestructible synthetic skin or flamethrower hands. This is what you're thinking about on your way to the toy section when your stomach begins to gurgle again from the King's Meal cheese fries you had last night. They haven't been sitting too well with you today. You make a detour to the restroom and duck into the first stall. Good places to think, public restrooms. You don't have to worry about making too much of a mess or using too much toilet paper or whether or not your dad is waiting outside in the hall with his copy of the Wall Street Journal. And lately you've had a lot to think about. Most of it has to do with your mother's reaction when you complained to her several weeks ago about how hard it's become to track down the robo-warriors you don't already have. Maybe it's time to move on to something else, she said, pointedly unsympathetic. Like what? I don't know. I just think maybe you should try to broaden your perspectives a little. You're getting to that age. You wanted to ask her what age she was referring to, but there was no mistaking the veiled warning in the statement. Like age was something that required preparation, and you were afraid that pursuing the topic might steer the conversation in a much more serious direction than you were prepared for. Now, sitting there in the smelly enclave of the stall, your thoughts drift back to your birthday party 3 days earlier. Happy 11th birthday spelled out across the white cake and red icing thick as toothpaste. Double digits. You are double digits now. This, presumably, is a big deal. The consensus among you and your friends is that 10, while technically a double-digit number, doesn't hold the same significance as all the numbers that follow it, largely because there's a 0 in it. For all intents and purposes, 10 is simply an extension of 9. For whatever reason, you had imagined that you would feel different by this point, more capable, sure of yourself, more like a grown-up. But that hasn't been the case. If anything, you've begun to feel the exact opposite recently. Adrift, self-conscious, fearful in a dull, meandering sort of way. Your body has begun to feel like a garment you've outgrown, too tight in some places, uncomfortably loose in others. As if to make things worse, your mother has begun leaving obscure little pamphlets from her church-sponsored Parents in Action meetings on the top of your dresser while you're out. Your Body and You, Understanding Puberty. Nearly all of the covers feature illustrations of teenage males with a baseball bat or a glove, their eyes fixed on the ground and attitudes of sober reflection. These illustrations are the reason you haven't given any of the pamphlets more than a single read-through. Because whatever it is that's making those boys so depressed, you feel like you're better off not knowing. Presently, your thoughts are interrupted by a sound in the stall next to yours, the rustle of clothing, the clink of a belt. You hadn't bothered checking the other stalls when you came in, but had assumed all the same that you were alone. And the fact that you're not isn't really a big deal, except that after a few seconds you notice that the person hasn't flushed the toilet or even left the stall. There's just a sound of breathing coming from the other side of the partition, low, raspy huffs, heavy, but steady. And I think I'm going to pause there before it gets really weird. So thank you very much for letting me read, and hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, you did stop at sort of a cliffhanger moment. And let me say the story does get very interesting, as all the stories in oceanography are. Please, if anyone has any questions for either Jordan or Jeremy, please post them in the chat. I will start with a question or a topic or two, I think, and then we'll go from there. Jordan, your poems, obviously, at least in Constellarium, are highly influenced by your own life. They're very autobiographical, frequently. Jeremy, as a fiction writer, the stories, there may be autobiographical elements there, but the reader wouldn't necessarily know to what extent. So that seems like a very different place to start for each of you. And Jeremy is someone who also writes poetry. I'm curious whether you ever start from a more autobiographical standpoint, or if autobiography inspires your poems in a different way than it does your fiction, or whether there's not a difference there for you. And Jordan, I actually don't know if you write fiction or other genres, Jordan. If you write in other genres, I'd be curious if there's a difference in that respect for you as well. But Jeremy, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, it's a good question. My poetry, which I'm sort of just a poet hobbyist, is very autobiographical. I write about my family, I write about my son, I write about things that have happened. The fiction, it's hard to say whether it's autobiographical or not, because all the stories do contain elements of my life. There's always something from my life in the story. But I don't know, maybe it's because I'm not as in touch with my feelings as I should be. I'm not good at processing things in my life sometimes. I'm not good at looking at them objectively. And so I write about them, and I create characters that I can use to sort of, I can look through their eyes and give them their own sets of imperfections to deal with. So it's a difficult question to answer. Yeah, the fiction is autobiographical, but not as obviously as my poetry. Because I like characters. I think ultimately in creative writing, I'm drawn to characters, and seeing what characters can do, and seeing them fail, seeing them try and seeing them fail is one of my favorite things about stories.
Because it's so identifiable, right?
Exactly right. So I use those characters to sort of examine things that I'm dealing with, or sort of examine things that I've experienced. So there is sort of a barrier there, but why do you
think that you approach poetry differently? Does it feel more natural to speak in your own voice in verse or in poetry than it does in fiction, or why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's 100% right. And I don't know why. It feels to me more natural to write poetry from my own perspective and not from a character I've created. It just feels more natural. It feels more honest, honestly. Like I said, poetry is not my forte. I do it mostly for fun. So I'm still learning a lot about it, and I'm sure my approach will change.
I've read exactly one of your poems, and I really loved it. So that's a good sign. I'd like to read more. Jordan, why for you is your poetry so tied to autobiography, and have you recently maybe or ever approach poetry from a less autobiographical standpoint?
That's a really good question, which is what people say when they don't have an answer for a really good question. That's a really good question. So I guess the way I approach, the best answer I can give you is the way I approach writing poems especially is just sitting and like the odd moments in between calls at work, or odd moments even before bed, or in between conversations with family or partner or whatever, and think like, what stories do I have? What have I lived through? What was that thing again that I wrote down that I forgot where I put it? Where are the notes? A lot of times, especially with the work from before transition, a lot of it was heavily research driven, to the point where, like there's a poem called Columbia, and I spent, maybe a year and a half just reading everything I could about Space Shuttle Columbia and the disaster that happened there. Just trying to understand. And most of that stuff, 98% of that stuff, didn't come anywhere near the poem. But I knew that I was profoundly impacted by the cockpit video that I saw right before the breakup of the shuttle, the conversation that was happening inside the shuttle. And then in that video, as it kept going, the video disintegrated itself, and that was like you saw nothing, but it was just flashes of color, and that was it. But before that happened, you could see plasma outside the window, which shouldn't have been there, and they were kind of marveling at it. So with that poem, there was a lot of research, but there was also kind of the sense of a very deep human connection with
Yeah, it still
with the
sprang out
tragedy.
of your experience of seeing that video. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a question here from Emma Smith Stevens for Jordan, and I'll just read what she says here. She says, Jordan, I guess this is a selfish question since I'm a writer of fiction primarily, but now I'm working on a memoir. How did you or have you navigated the publication of your book with your family? How open have you been in discussing your work with your family, and how open have they been with you about your book? And you read, I mean, it's interesting that you read a poem about, focused on your mother's response to your, at least to one point of your transition, and your father's.
They are aware that that a book exists, and it is on their bookshelf, and it's on my sister's bookshelf. And last I checked, my niece was reading it because she wanted to read my work, and I advised against that. To which my brother-in-law said, "No, she's a big girl. She can read this." I'm like, "Really?" So they haven't read it, but they have it. I think that they have separated the poems themselves, which are based on actual, some of them based on actual conversations, actual events that that I went through with them or had with them. They've separated the me of that and their understanding of the fiction of that, or of my just perception of that, from the reality of our relationship as it stood for several years after transition, which was non-existent, and just recently became good again. So yeah, it's complicated, I guess, is the best way I could say it. That's the best response people can give, I think, for family.
And it sounds like it took them time, took them years to process.
About a decade.
Yeah.
Not the poems, the transition. Yeah. After after all of it, I will Skype with them several times a week so they can talk to Athena, and they're still, every once in a while using the wrong pronouns back and forth when they're talking to each other. And my mom will use my old name, what is commonly called like a dead name. She'll use my old name when talking to my dad. But when my dad answers the phone, the first thing he does is he always goes to get my mom, and he says, it's Jordan. So even in his conversation with her, it's like he's processed it much better than she has. So, which one might expect, I think. So,
just like as a follow-up question, hi everyone, welcome to my bedroom. I don't know. Do you think that the not reading the book, like, I don't know your parents, are they readers at all? Like, is it a very specific choice to not enter into that realm, do you think, on their part? Or is it just sort of also something that they wouldn't normally be interacting with anyway?
They're both readers. They both read constantly as I was growing up. My mom, the older she got, began to like Agatha Christie, and started reading all of that. But before that, I have a lot of evidence because these are the books that I found. I have like Longfellow and Wordsworth and Shakespeare and, all of these classics which had been read by somebody, War and Peace, and I suspect my mom had read those. I just don't think she ever really wanted to read what, one of her children wrote about something that kind of tore her apart, I think. So I think it's more of a perspective of I don't want to look at that because it feels terrible already.
Right.
Or I don't want to look at that because it's a headache kind of thing too. So, yeah.
I can empathize in that. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Yeah. I have a follow-up genre question, and then Nick has a question for both of you. And this is just a very brief question. Jordan, I'm curious, and maybe you don't have an answer for this. Maybe it's the way it is. But I'm curious whether you have considered or have done any work in another genre, say memoir or nonfiction, that is also autobiographical, or do you always process your life experience through poetry?
Honestly, poetry is kind of, it's one of the first and the last places that I want to go to write about anything. So I think I process my life experiences by the story, story by story. And when I started really writing, when I understood that this is what I needed to do, this is, what I would do in my life, I started writing fiction, and all the feedback that I got, or a lot of the feedback that I got, is this is so poetic, you should write poems. So I started writing poems, and this is too depressing, you should write fiction. And so
you can't win.
You can't win. But I really it's kind of like I'm saving the best for last. I want to work with creative nonfiction, and I think in a way that's what a lot of the best work ends up being, whether it's fiction or poetry. It's in the realm of creative nonfiction, because we can't write from any position other than our own. We can't write truly from any perception other than our own, because we all have the base set of emotions there,
Oh, is that Jeremy? What was your response?
That was a good way of phrasing it.
Nick has a question, a practical question for both of you. What is some of the best writing advice you've ever received? Let's start with Jeremy.
I've received a lot of writing advice. Some of it's been really good. Some of it has not been so good. But I think if I'm just off the top of my head, there was a piece of advice that I heard maybe just like a year or two ago. At my university, we have a readers series, and we bring in a couple different readers each semester. And we've been bringing in some really great readers. We brought in Hanif Abdurraqib, and he read some poetry and some nonfiction. And afterward, he took questions. And someone, I think, asked him a similar question, what is some advice you would give for a young writer? And he said, you have to be prepared to write a lot of stuff that only you're going to read for a long time. And it sounded very dour, and I don't think he meant it that way. I think all he meant was writing ultimately is a solitary endeavor. And, you can share it with your friends. You can write a story and share it with your friends. But as far as making, a profession out of it, as far as trying to establish yourself in, creative writing community, you are going to end up writing a lot of stuff that only you're going to see. And that should be the way it is. That really should be the way it is. I think you should spend a lot of time going over your own work and just sort of living with it and figuring out, okay, what am I good at? What do I want to write about? And just sort of stumbling over and over again until you build up your craft. So I think that's probably one of the best pieces of advice I've ever heard. And I think it makes a lot of sense to me.
Great. Jordan, how about you?
Oh, wow. Best writing advice I've ever gotten. I can tell you what comes to mind. I've worked with amazing poets and amazing fiction writers and amazing creative nonfiction writers. But this is what comes to mind right now at this point. I was playing darts with a friend during my master's degree many, many years ago, and was just not getting anywhere with something that I've been working on for over a year. Usually I'd work on a poem for about 2 years, 2.5 years before I would try to publish it, try to send it out to publish. I've been working on this one for about a year. And all of a sudden, in the middle of all of my complaining about this poem, he turns around from the dartboard with these darts and he looks at me, and he quoted a line from this movie from the 80s called Over the Top by Sylvester Stallone was in it. And he said, you just got to turn it around, right? You got to turn the hat around, which is when Sylvester Stallone like beats everybody arm wrestling. That's the, but when you apply it to writing, and when you apply it to your perspective, and when you apply it to your kind of like sense of mood and understanding of self in the moment, in relation to writing, I think that's damn good advice. When you get stuck, just turn it around. Just back up and see what else is behind you. See what's to the left, what's to the right. Look around, because once you kind of pull your head away from the work that you've been buried in, you begin to see the world. And then a little bit later on, you begin to see, in some ways, yourself reflected in the world. And I believe that sense of reunification, that sense of connection, is where we begin again with our work. So there's that. And another amazing piece of advice that I got was annotate as you go. When I had just started working in pharma, writing copy for pharma, an amazing mentor that I worked with, she's just an incredible human being. I just messed up annotations, which for pharma is really kind of nuts. It's just nuts as it is. But she just sent this really, lowercase message, annotate as you go. It's easier that way, smiley face. And I think that works definitely with pharma writing, but it also works with any other kind of writing that you're doing, in that you need to pay attention to where you're going, but also constantly look around. Again, for me, it's about looking around. It's about perspective. Get perspective and understand where you are. And I think that find your position by what you know. I think that's the process of writing, essentially, there.
Right. Jordan, Jeremy, you both make it sound like writing's a lot of work. I mean, come on.
Oh, my.
Can I just start an Instagram page and just put it out there?
You can.
Okay, good.
No one's
I'm
stopping
just
you.
kidding. No, I really admire that perspective, that both of you really invest the time to process the work. Jordan says she usually works on the poem 2 to 3 years. Jeremy shared the advice about, you've got to let that Hanifa, your kid gave, you've got to be prepared to be the only one who sees your writing for a long time. And as an editor and a publisher, as well as a writer, I wholeheartedly agree with that. I read a lot of work that gets sent out by authors seeking publication that really seems like it was written very quickly and was not given the time to mature and develop and evolve. So I highly value the advice that you've given. Well, thank you again, everyone. I want to mention one last thing about Orison. I mentioned that Jeremy's book won our fiction prize a couple years ago. We are currently taking submissions for our fiction and poetry prizes. The judges this year, the judge in fiction is Deborah Spark, and the judge in poetry is Jericho Brown. So please check out our website, orisonbooks.com. You can find out all the information about the Orison prizes in poetry and fiction. Thank you again, Jeremy and Jordan. Thank you, Jackie. I'll turn it back to you to have the last word. Please order books through Hub City. Thank you so much, Jackie, for having us.
Guys, that was an absolutely wonderful discussion. I put in the chat that I just loved the perspectives that you guys all brought to this. Jordan and Jeremy and Luke. I did put a link to Horizon Books for Luke in the chat window. Please feel free to go check that out. Orison, sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. And Hub City Books also has links for ordering the book in the chat as well. And this will be signed by the author. So again, thank you everyone for coming, and we will see you next time. Thank you again, Jeremy, Jordan, and Luke.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
Night.